Bismillahir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers and sisters, as we all know, we are on a journey. We are journeying on to the next life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Ya ayyuhal insanu innaka kadihun ila rabbika kadahan famulaqi. That, O man, indeed you are all working and laboring restlessly to your Lord, and you will eventually meet Him. This is the reality of this life. We are all on a journey, and it's of paramount importance that we as believers structure our lives based upon this premise, knowing that we are not here on a permanent basis. This abode that we live in is merely a temporary stop, a temporary station, and we will eventually reach the next life. Hence Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he told us, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharibun aw abiru sabil." Be in this life as though you are a stranger or someone passing by. A stranger or a passerby does not take their temporary residency as their permanent home. They take what is necessary in order to reach their final destination. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَتَزَوَّدُوا فَإِنَّ خَيْرَ الزَّادِ التَّقْوَى. Take your provisions, and the best provisions is that of taqwa, God consciousness, being aware of Allah, being mindful of Him, fearing Him, yearning for Him, loving Him, and constantly remembering Him. These are the provisions for the believer in this life. If we do not have this perception of life, and we become neglectful of our final destination, we will eventually take up this home as our permanent residency, even though it will not be permanent for us. Moreover, as a result of that, we will become heedless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We will lose our way in this dunya. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "Ala wa inna dunya mal'una, mal'unu ma fiha." That the entire dunya is mal'una. Literally means it's cursed. But what it means is that the dunya, if you have the wrong attitude towards the dunya, if you don't have the right framework of mind with the way you perceive your existence in this worldly life, it becomes mal'una in the sense that it makes you distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the afterlife. Mal'unun ma fiha. Whatever is within the dunya as well, it takes you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except for a few things. Illa dhikrullah, except for the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa ma walahu, and that which is associated with the remembrance of Allah. Aw alimun wa alimun aw muta'allim, or a scholar, a man of knowledge, a person of knowledge, or a seeker of knowledge. These are the exceptions. Why is that the case? Why is it the remembrance of Allah, a man of knowledge, and a seeker of knowledge? Why are they and these things their exceptions to the dunya being cursed? Because the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us closer to Allah, makes us understand the purpose of this existence and this journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The scholar is someone who has the knowledge of Allah in his heart and has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as his final goal. The seeker, the muta'allim, and the student of knowledge, the one who seeks to attain this level of knowledge that connects him to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the afterlife, is on that path. So he is not far from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For this reason, the believer takes the matter of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worshipping Him, learning about Him, learning about the things that He loves, learning about what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These things are so important for the seeker of the afterlife. Without these elements, we will lose our way. Without learning about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without learning about the things that He loves and the things that He dislikes, without learning about these provisions, we will lose our way in this dunya. This is why the believer ought to have a strong connection with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala contains all the necessary provisions by which, inshallah, we can reach the afterlife in a state of peace and safety, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being pleased with us. In the book of Allah, we find not about who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, what He expects from us, how we ought to worship Him in a way which is pleasing to Him. The believer is therefore someone who pays great attention to not just learning and memorizing the Qur'an, but studying its meanings, learning about each chapter of the Qur'an, learning about the major themes, topics, etc. The believer learns the Sharia, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ought to be worshipped. This is manifested in our study of fiqh. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihuhu fid din." If Allah wishes good for a person, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him fiqh and understanding of the religion. Moreover, the Qur'an lies as the foundation of our spiritual studies, how we draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions and explains the various states of the human being in the Qur'an, our weaknesses, how we can draw closer to Him by the various actions of the heart. These are the fundamental provisions that we should never neglect as believers. Whether it be that we look for these provisions in the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in our own homes, whichever means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has facilitated for us. But my sincere advice to myself and to all of you is to never neglect this path. Always aim to seek these provisions, always aim for the afterlife, always look for which provisions you can take on your journey to the afterlife. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grants us these provisions, that He grants us the sincerity on this journey, that He makes this journey safe for us, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us with reaching the final destination, and that He is pleased with us. Wa jazakumullahu khairan, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.